Here's a little bit about Otto. He was born on June 3rd in 1873 in Frankfurt, Germany, and raised in a Jewish family. His father wanted him to study medicine and become a clinician, so he began studying at the University of Strasbourg in 1891 and ultimately got his medical doctoral degree in 1896. He then took a position at the University of Graz in 1903, where he stayed until being forced out of Germany, and finally he became the chair of pharmacology in Graz in 1905. He worked mostly as a pharmacologist, however, his path there was not traditional. He initially aspired to be a clinician, but after seeing firsthand the high mortality rates of tuberculosis and pneumonia in the late 1890s, specifically through about 1896 to 1899, he shifted his focus to pharmacology, where he thought he could make a real meaningful impact. He was very gifted in the field of pharmacology and began studies at first in metabolism at the University of Marburg, but ended up winning a Nobel Prize in the realm of neurotransmitters. In 1902, his career started to take off when he published a paper on protein synthesis in the animal body that proved that animals actually have the ability to rebuild their proteins from their degraded amino acids. In 1905, he proved that the heart, in contrast to the liver, cannot utilize fructose. And finally, he also found that epinephrine injections into rabbits that were completely depleted of their liver glycogen by starvation was able to bring glycogen back up to normal levels. In this context, epinephrine injections are, think of today's EpiPens. So let's talk a little bit more about his important studies from 1902 to 1908. He transitioned to pharmacology and began his career in metabolism under Hans Meyer, a famous and notable German scientist of the time. And he researched glucose metabolism and nutrition to prove that animals were able to rebuild proteins from amino acids, which we previously mentioned. In 1902, he met one of the most influential people in his life, a lifelong friend and colleague who he would go on to share a Nobel Prize with in 1936, named Henry Dale. Now, let's talk about how he won this Nobel Prize. It actually started with a dream. It was the night before Easter Sunday in 1920 when Otto woke up. He turned on the light at 3 a.m. and jotted down a few notes on a piece of scrap paper. He then went back to sleep and woke up again at 6 and realized that he had wrote something very important at 3, but he couldn't discern his sloppy notes. So he goes to sleep the next night, and at 3 a.m. he wakes up from the same dream again and formulates an experiment. And this experiment aimed to determine whether or not his hypothesis, which was from 17 years prior to this, of chemical transmission was correct. So he went to the lab and decided to perform this experiment. This experiment includes the following. It actually includes frog hearts, and this is what got him to the Nobel Prize. This was Loewi's most famous experiment. It was published in 1921, and it largely answered his questions. So he dissected 2 beating hearts out of frogs. One included the vagus nerve, which controls the heart rate, and the other heart did not. He bathed both of these hearts in a saline solution, and then he electrically stimulated the vagus nerve on the heart that included it. He took some of the liquid from that heart, applied it to the second heart, and found that the second heart was also beating at the same pace as the first heart. And this was monumental because it proved that chemicals released by the vagus nerve can actually control the heart rate. And this was one of the most influential studies because it was the first one to demonstrate that the release of a chemical substance could cause a response without electrical stimulation. He initially called this chemical Vagustov, but it was later found that it corresponded to acetylcholine. Loewi overall made great strides in the field of neuroscience. He was an instrumental figure in learning about neurotransmitters, and he discovered acetylcholine to show that the language of nerve cell communication is actually chemical and not so much electrical. That takes us to the more sad parts of his life, including the German invasion of Austria. He was arrested with his 2 sons during the invasion because of his Jewish background, and he was only able to be released after scientists in his community went into uproar, and he gave all his possessions and handed his research over to the Nazis, as well as the money he earned from winning the Nobel Prize. Finally, he and his sons were able to make it out of this unfortunate situation where they were brutalized and imprisoned. And in 1946, he followed one of his sons to the U.S. and took a position at NYU. I chose Loewi for a multitude of reasons. Both of us come from an Austrian Jewish background, and he exemplifies resilience and sacrifice. He was resilient in the fact that he went against his father's wishes for him to become a clinician, but still found a middle ground and excelled in pharmacology. He had a strong commitment to his family as he followed his sons, who he loved dearly. He was a hard worker and a tactical thinker, and above all else, he was a risk taker. Thank you.